In the last episode, Randy taught us how to catch fish on a squarebill crankbait up the river arms of lakes during the dog days of summer. In this video, I'm going to share how I caught fish offshore during the exact same day, but doing something completely different. Well, speaking of deep water options, that's what I did today. And today was actually flip-flop from my usual shallow versus offshore challenge situation. I landed on the fish first thing this morning, which is very rare. In our last challenge, I was catching them in the last 15 minutes of the day. The spot that I was catching them was actually a main lake point. It had a very gradual slope and it dropped off sharp on the end. There's a brush pile on the end and there was a bunch of bait fish there. It was really interesting because when I was graphing over it, I was expecting there to be a lot of spots like this, and when I first saw it, I'm like, this is the spot. I'm gonna crush him here. And I spun around, and my first cast in there with a flutter spoon, I lose like a 2.5 pound spotted bass. I then pick up a swim bait, and I catch one right away, a solid 3-pounder. So I'm starting my day off with a 3-pounder. I switch over to a Magnum, that big bladed chatterbait I made that video on recently. Lost another like 2.25 pounder. I had another fish bite on, I think it was a hair jig or something else. And finally, I decided to slow down and throw the Offshore Neko rig, which is the bait I've been experimenting with a lot recently to try to maximize these offshore schools. It's a really unique bait that I don't really see a lot of guys throwing.
No, they don't, not at all.
It's almost like the new drop shot for offshore fish. Pretty crazy. And let me just show you guys some of the fish catches from this and also me explaining how I rig this Neko rig as well. And there we go, got that fish on the Neko rig. It's a pretty unique rig that I made a video about recently that's great for catching some inactive offshore bass. So check that video out using the link in the description if you haven't seen that. I actually got that fish caught with my marker buoy because my graphs are so old that they actually are so outdated that the waypoints won't transfer between them anymore. So I have to use the marker buoy to mark my spots. And I made a video explaining how to offshore spots using either a marker buoy or by using linked graphs with waypoints. And so usually I would use the waypoint system, but right now I don't have that option. So I'm using the old school marker buoy approach until I get some new graphs. And either way, it's working. And man, I'm having to use every rod on the deck of the boat to get these fish to bite. I've got fish on 4 different baits. And that's really the reason why I carry so many different rods when I go fishing, because a lot of times on offshore fish, you need to switch up the baits once they get conditioned to one to continue to catch them. This is a really important point because throwing multiple baits on an offshore school has almost become a necessity, especially as the fishing pressure offshore has increased. When I started fishing offshore back in 2010, 2012, there was relatively little fishing pressure away from the bank. This means you can catch fish on a deep diving crankbait, a football jig, and that's pretty much it. That's all I ever threw. But after about 2015, offshore technology started to improve with the graphs, with the mapping, as well as the information out there. The fish then have become a lot more pressured, and as a result, the traditional standby baits like a football jig and a crankbait, while still effective, are not the only tools you need to get the job done. This has led me and other serious offshore bass fishermen to start rotating a lot more baits on these offshore schools, as well as experimenting with new baits. On average, I carry 10 rods on the deck of the boat when I go offshore fishing, and I have 10 different baits on each of those rods. The reason for this is because when I pull up on an offshore spot and I see a school of fish down there, there's no guarantee that I'm the first person that has fished this school, and nowadays it's very unlikely that I'm even the first person that's fished that school that day. Therefore, if I throw the traditional baits, like a football jig, like a crankbait, those fish have probably already seen them already and I'm not going to get bit. And nowadays, baits like a drop shot and a Ned rig and a shaky head are also not as effective as they were a few years ago because a lot of guys are throwing them. This has led to a lot of experimentation with new baits, and dating back to like 2010, we started with the hair jigs, then the Magnum flutter spoons, then the scrounger heads, so on and so forth. And every time a new bait comes out, it's really effective for, let's say, 2 to 3 years. Then it loses some of its effectiveness as it kind of catches on in the mainstream. Now, I have recently stumbled upon this offshore Neko rig or Neko rig that has been extremely effective for me just because I don't think anyone else is throwing it on my lakes. Brett Height threw this back in 2015 during a bass fest on Kentucky Lake, and I'm sure other guys fish it around the country, but it just isn't that popular in my area of the country. And that's the holy grail of offshore fishing, finding a bait that no one else is throwing. And the spot that I'm fishing right here is actually a very popular, highly pressured area on Table Rock Lake. And I'm sure these fish have seen a ton of different baits. And as you saw, I threw 4 different baits at this offshore school, and I got bit once on 3 of the baits, but they were just kind of nipping at it and they kind of came off halfway to the boat, or I just barely got them in the boat. But after switching to that Neko rig, I was able to land several more fish in quick succession and kind of milk the spot for all that was worth. This is what I used to be able to do with a drop shot and a shaky head back in the day, but even those baits weren't working on this day, so that Neko rig is a really good way to trigger those schools. It's probably going to get ruined after I post a few more videos about it, and I'll have a little bit of time to take advantage of it, and then it'll be done, and I'll start looking for new baits. But if you're graphing offshore schools of fish, you see them down there, and you know that they're bass, but you can't trigger them to bite, 90% of the time it's just that you either pulling up there at the wrong time of day, or you're throwing a bait that the fish are already conditioned to, and you need to change up your presentation to get those fish in the boat. Let me show you how I rig up this offshore Neko rig. It starts with a 1/0 or a 2/0 Gamakatsu finesse Neko hook. I'll then take a 6.5 inch Yamamoto Kut Tail Worm in either green pumpkin or all black. And I actually went through all my green pumpkin worms this morning, so all black is the only color I have, but it's been putting fish in the boat today, so it's not a problem. I'll put a small O-ring that is clear on the skinny tail of the worm and thread it onto the middle of the worm by the egg sac, just like this. Next, I'll take this 1/8 ounce Dobyns nail weight and insert it into the tail, the fat end of this cut tail worm. The reason I like this cut tail worm so much is because it has a fatter end here and a skinnier end on this side. And I found that this is the best worm for that offshore Neko setup. It's really heavy, it has a big profile, it really puts some big fish in the boat. Finally, I'll take this 1/0 hook, I'll put it through that O-ring in the center of the worm with the hook point going towards the skinny tail of the worm and the nail weight pointed on the back side of the hook, just like this. This is all I do is set it up. I'll put that on a 7'4" medium action quantum smoke spinning rod with 20-pound fluorocarbon or 20-pound braided line main line, 8-pound fluorocarbon leader, and then a quantum smoke spinning reel. That's all there is to it. Now let's go back to catching some more fish. And all I'm doing to fish this bait is just casting it out onto this offshore point where I see all these fish. That bait then is going to sink all the way down to the bottom, and that might take anywhere from 15 to 20 seconds because I'm fishing in like 20 to 25 feet. And then once that bait's down there, all I'm doing is basically shaking that bait as if I was fishing a Wacky rig warm-up shallow, but I'm doing it basically in 20 feet of water. So the retrieve is just to shake that rod up pretty high in the air, and it seems like a lot of these fish are actually getting it as I'm shaking that bait up in the water. And that bait will fall in back down to the bottom, and once it makes bottom contact, I'm gonna shake my rod up pretty high and then let it fall back down. That's the retrieve. It seems to work really well with these fish when they're in inactive mood. It's put a lot of really good fish in the boat for me today, so let's see if I can get a few more fish and milk this spot for all it's worth. And it was really interesting because I really was able to maximize these offshore areas with the Neko rig, and I thought that I was going to be able to take that momentum and expand on it in the rest of the areas of the lake. I went about 2 miles south of where I caught those fish, and I also went 2 miles north of where I caught those fish, and I never found anything else. Not a single school of fish was set up in a way where I could actually get them to bite.
You know, what's really interesting about that is, you know, last week we were down here and Johnny had found, you know, quite a few fish that we caught on his new football jig out in that 20-25 foot of water. But we had visibility in probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 feet. But up here in the river, well, you had less than 2 foot of visibility and you're still catching them out of the same water depth. I mean, to me, that's interesting. You know, those fish are using that deeper water without the visibility.
I was really surprised at that, actually. And I thought that the bite was going to be somewhat better as I went further down the lake, getting to that clear water, kind of like what we were doing last week. But there just wasn't anything out there. Those schools that looked like they were very spread out. And in my opinion, I feel like those schools probably were really well grouped up and spread out, or grouped together and schooled up 2 to 3 weeks ago. We mentioned before they're pulling a lot of current drawn down the lake. And when they're drawing down a lot of water, pulling water out of the lake, that will position those fish on top of main lake points, ledges, humps. Right. But today it seemed like the water was a little bit less, it wasn't dropping as much, there was less current going on. And that usually is going to cause those fish to suspend and spread out a little bit more. And usually as you get into that August, like late July, August, September time, the number of big offshore schools that are grouped up and catchable decrease. There may only be 2 or 3 good spots, every 4 or 5 miles up a stretch of a lake, and you have to kind of like peck around, hunt, and search for them a lot more than you have to do in, you know, May and June.
Right. Yeah, that's why, I mean, it's, you know, it's known that when you get into that late summer, early fall, to me, that's some of the toughest fishing you're going to have all year long, just because what you said, a lot of the fish, they just disappear. They become ghost fish. I don't know if they're swimming out in the middle of the lake, they're setting up on isolated stuff that nobody's fishing. It's just a mystery, but, you know, when that water temperature is in the 80s, and until it starts cooling down rapidly, like into the 60s, to me, it's some of the toughest fishing of the year.
For sure. I spent 5 of the 7 hours today just graphing around trying to locate schools of fish that were catchable. There just weren't any out there except for that one spot I found, and I actually was able to come back to that spot on 2 different occasions and actually upgrade my bag. I ended up with about 12.5 pounds of fish. I caught about a 3-pounder on this Neko rig and then a couple more 2.5 pounders after coming back, and I actually saw a few people fishing that spot while I was just driving around running between spots. It's crazy that this Neko rig really will allow you to fish right behind other anglers just because no one's fishing it.
Yeah, it's just like using live bait in there. They just have never seen it. Yeah.
That's something that is really fascinating when you're offshore. I think that a lot of these fish are getting so conditioned to a drop shot, to a Ned rig, that I don't get that many bites on them anymore. Right. You need to go to these baits that no one else is fishing. And you know, in your area of the country, maybe on Tennessee River, there might be a lot of guys that are already throwing this, and you actually need to find something that's even more cutting edge, or go backwards, maybe pick up the old 4-foot Carolina rig, yeah, or a Wacky rig worm with a super light weight, something that these fish have not seen. In this part of the country right now, it doesn't seem like very many fish are seeing this because I'm catching a lot of fish on this bait, and it's kind of right now my new favorite rig for when I find a school of fish I'm trying to catch them, and I feel like I can catch 5, 6, 7 extra bass every single spot I go to throwing this as opposed to throwing my normal baits.
Yeah, that's a big deal. And like, you know, I fish for a living and I've never caught a fish in a tournament on the Neko rig, so that goes to show you how nobody's fishing it. I mean, there's a handful of people that do, but a lot of people aren't, and you can't ever underestimate the fact that a new presentation or a new bait or a new color or a new wobble or a new profile has on heavily pressured fish. And you know, it's just amazing what makes those fish, what generates strikes and won't anymore.
It's pretty interesting because I was throwing that hair jig back in 2012, and from 2012 to 2015 I would say that most of my top tournament finishes came with a combination of my normal offshore baits like a deep diving crankbait, a 10-inch worm, a football jig, mixing with that hair jig, and the hair jig would produce my better than average fish because no one else was throwing them. Now that hair jig's kind of played out, a lot of guys are fishing it, even here on Table Rock now, so you have to go to something that's even more finesse or just different. I wouldn't say it's any more finesse than a hair jig. I even threw the hair jig today and never caught a fish, which is very weird. Right. Normally I can catch them on that, but this bait, thrown in the exact same spot with the same cast, generated a strike when those other baits weren't. Yeah. And that's something that I think a lot of guys underestimate, is the power of experimenting with new baits, new retrieves. The challenge with doing that is it takes a lot of effort. Kind of like when I fished that Magnum chatterbait, that 1.5 ounce chatterbait on Grand Lake. I went out all day and only got 2 bites on it. But once I figured out how those fish, the retrieve, the approach, like this bait, I'm using a very unique retrieve with it. Even when I have this bait, you could throw this bait and still not catch him on it if you're not using the exact retrieve I'm using. And I've talked about that in a recent video of how I'm fishing this. And that sort of approach of the combination of the bait plus the retrieve plus the right rod, line, setup, all of that is crucial to getting these fish to bite. And that just comes from a lot of experimentation.
Yeah, and you know, everything has changed so much, because I can remember 20, 25 years ago fishing all these lakes in this part of the country. You know, if we were on a deep bite, like at the summertime, fish were on the points, you'd have one rod out, it'd be a deep crankbait. That'd be it. You wouldn't have anything else. And now you look at some of the top level tournament anglers, they got 20 rods in their boat, just like what Johnny's talking about. Neko rig, they'll have a hair jig, they'll have a spoon, they'll have a football hair jig, they'll have 2 or 3 different type of crankbaits. Scroungers, they've got just everything. So
just name what's on the deck of my boat right now.
Exactly. So I mean, fish have got smarter, they've evolved, you know, and anglers have too. And so, man, if you don't keep up with the new stuff like the Neko rig, you know, and the cutting edge technology, you're going to get left behind and not catch as many fish.
Especially offshore. I think that the shallow water game that you're doing is actually a lost art. And that's why I'm fascinated by it, because I think that if you can mix up some of the offshore game like what I'm doing, but also still maintain some of that shallow water element, you can mix in, for example, today, if you only have one offshore spot, I could go and rotate that spot 2 or 3 times throughout the day, but that only takes me 2 hours. The other 6 hours, we could go up shallow and fill in with some more 2.5, 3 pounders. And instead of having 12.5 pounds for myself, maybe 11, 12 pounds for you, we could combine that and potentially get up to that 13, 14, 15 pound range, which we need to do well in the tournament.
Yeah, and you know, it takes a different mentality or a different mindset, because like the way that you are fishing today, you could theoretically win a tournament off of 1 spot, and definitely off of 2 spots. But for me, if I was to win a tournament, it would be a grind. I'm going after 1 fish at a time, 1 here, 1 there, a log here, a rock here, a dock there. I've got to maximize every opportunity that I get, because I'm not going to get those flurries where I get 10 in a row like you are fishing offshore. But you can be equally successful with either technique. You know, some days some are better than others.
I'd say that up until this point, we've been very equal in our shallow versus offshore. I may have out-edged you just a little bit, I feel like, on the offshore, just from a quality perspective, not really from a numbers, but I think that has more to do with the time of year we're in, as opposed to the style of fishing and our what we're doing. The time of year really dictates that, and I think that as we go more into the fall, into October, November, December, we're going to see that flip pretty heavy.
Yeah, that's, this time of year, after about late May in most parts of the country, the majority of the bass are deeper. They're in that mid-range to deeper areas. I mean, but you still have, a population of fish, 25% of the population that may live shallow all year, but you're not fishing for where the biggest populations of fish are, which are out in that deeper water.
Randy, I feel like it was a success. You caught them up shallow, I caught them offshore. We did pretty much the same. I may have edged you on weight just a tiny bit, but I think for numbers and general size, we did pretty similar. And as we get into August, into September, I think that's going to be a pretty common trend. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think it's going to flip a little bit, and to me it's an interesting study of bass behavior, because like I said, I enjoy fishing shallow, you enjoy fishing deep. We're getting to see how this is going to progress and manifest as the season goes on, based upon water, temperatures, sunlight hours we have in the day. There's going to be some factors that change through the seasons, and I'm really excited to see how this all pans out over the course of 12 months.
For sure. Well, hopefully we'll be able to continue catching them. We've been on a pretty good streak of fish catches, at least getting some decent fish in the boat. I'm sure one of these days, either me or you, one of us is going to bomb pretty bad, and I think that'll be interesting as well, because really we haven't had a really bad day. I was on the verge of having a really bad day on Stockton the other day, but those are also days you can learn from a lot, because there hasn't been a day where neither of us caught fish, or we didn't get fish shallow or deep. One of these days though, I know that either the offshore bite or the shallow bite is just going to be non-existent. We're not going to be able to get them to bite hardly at all. Yeah. And that's going to be even more fascinating for me.
Yeah, it is. It's like I said, there's no guarantees in fishing. I mean, I've had tournaments where I was so dialed in practice on them that I just knew I was going to catch them. It was just a matter, are they going to weigh 20 or 25 pounds? And then I go out there and I don't have a bite all day long. And then I've had tournaments where I didn't get a bite for 3 days of practice and almost win the tournament. So, like I said, fish change every day. It's just like, the namesake of the sight fish, the moment. You really have to do it. That is that to me, that's the most important philosophy in fishing, is you've got to fish the current conditions, you've got to stay present and be in the moment all the time.
Fish the moment, guys. You heard from Randy, you've heard from me several times, and that's the way to do it. So thanks again, guys, for checking out this video. Hopefully you enjoyed. Thanks, Randy, for another great day. We're going to be back at it again, and we're going to be doing a great shallow water full breakdown for you guys with that square bill crankbait as well, so look forward to that. Other than that, thanks for checking out the video. We'll see y'all next one.